If you want to have a great retirement, you don't need better answers. What you need are better questions.
Are you ready to make the most of the only life you have? To make smart money choices focused on achieving what you care about most? Here to help you balance living well today without sacrificing your tomorrow is the Retirement Answer Man, Roger Whitney.
When someone finds out that I manage assets for clients and I have this agile retirement management process, I get a lot of the same kinds of questions. Hey, where do you think the markets are going to go between now and the end of the year? How should I allocate my 401k or my investment account? Hey, where's the dollar going? Do you think I should buy gold as a hedge? Are interest rates going to go up this year? Are bonds the right investment? What is the quote-unquote right withdrawal rate so I know I'll never run out of money? Am I saving enough? Now, these are all very important questions. But you notice something similar to them all? They're very tactical questions. And this is where pretty much everybody in the financial advice industry and in the media want us to stay. They want us to stay in tactical questions, such as how should we invest? Should I buy this? Where is this going to go? And you know why? Because these are transactional questions. These are questions that have a transaction associated with them. Should I buy gold? Well, yes, you should. Here's how you do it. How should I allocate my investment account? Well, fill out this form out and I'll create the portfolio and I'll allocate it for you. Where are the markets going to go? Down. That's why you should buy this hedge. Now, tactics are great. Tactics are important. They can really move the dial, but tactics generally should never be discussed first. They're not quality questions when it comes to creating a great retirement. Tactics are choosing the tools to get the job done, but until you've defined what the job is, best to leave the tools in the toolbox. So in this episode, we're going to talk about some more important questions that you should be asking to help you create a great retirement, but we can't do any of that until we have this all-important disclaimer. Well, I got one answer for you right off the top, and this one is pretty quality. Don't take advice from me. Well, anyway, on the show, because I don't know anything about you, and I only give advice to clients I work for as a fiduciary. So before you make any decisions, talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor. Consider this as helpful hints and education, because that's just common sense. Let's get to the hot topic. Let's be honest. Traditional retirement planning is broken. It worked for your parents, but it doesn't work for you, this modern retiree that's going to live longer, spend more money, and be more active than any generation in history. If you want to have a great retirement, it's time that you used a different approach. That's why I've created the 5-Minute Retirement Makeover, which is a free 3-video series that talks about how to be agile in your decision-making and start asking the right questions. So if you're ready to learn about a new, more modern, more agile way to work towards a great retirement, go to 5minuteretirementmakeover.com. Well, in the news today, Gallup reported that America's financial worry has edged up. Not a surprise. I think there's a lot of angst about the economy and where things are at. So every year, Gallup, in addition to all the other polls and surveys that they do, they survey to see what are America's top financial worries. And they have a list. I'll have a link to it in 6 Shot Saturday. But let's look at the top 2, or 3. So number 3 on the list is not being able to maintain the standard of living you enjoy. 51% said they are very concerned about that. Totally understandable. Number 2 on the list, at 60% of Americans being very concerned about this. This is a big one. Not being able to pay medical costs of a serious illness or accident at 60%. I know from experience with clients in my network, a serious medical expense can literally bankrupt a family. very easily. So I can understand why this is a big concern. And number one on the list at 64% is not having enough money to retire. Now, what I find interesting about these surveys, especially when we look at the worries, is when we look at what proactive steps people are taking to try to mitigate these risks, whether it's serious illness, standard of living, or having a great retirement, and where there's an incongruence statistically of what people are actually doing and what they're worried about. Now, I'm not saying this for everybody, but I think it's instructive to people not asking the right questions, and as a result, feeling like they have a lot less power over things. So let's take number 3, which is not being able to maintain their standard of living over time. Totally understandable. So if that's a worry, if that's number 3 on the list, you would think the majority of those people would be taking steps to address that concern. What steps could you take to worry about maintaining your standard of living? Now, I say those people, I'm talking about me too, because I have to control myself as well when it comes to standard of living. Well, what steps can you take? Well, if my standard of living, once I've become a empty nester, balloons because I have free time and earning a lot and have extra money, is fancy bicycles, fancy iPhones, fancy technology, nice car, and all those other trappings. Well, if I elevate my standard of living too high, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain. So if you're worried about maintaining your standard of living, yeah, you got to figure out how to do that on the income end. But we got to remember, we have a big lever over here on what we can do on how we define what that standard of living is. I know couples, I work with couples that are totally fulfilled living on what many would say most people couldn't live on, but they're happy as a clam. Their standard of living fits them. Now, number 2, we're worried about the medical cost of a serious illness or accident. Great point. Now, there are those unforeseeable things that we don't really have a lot of control over, whether it's cancer, a car accident, something that happens upon us. Now, I get that there are a lot of those, but I'm interested when we're worried about medical costs, but still the vast majority of Americans don't eat in a healthy way. They don't exercise in a healthy way. They don't wear their seatbelt or their bicycle helmet or all these other things that could help in preventing or lowering what potential medical costs could be. Now, not always, but there are proactive things in all of these worries that we could be doing, and statistically, we don't see that happening. And that includes not having enough money for retirement. If that's the number one worry, what are people doing proactively to deal with this worry? That, I think, is the most important question. Now, I understand that life happens to everybody, and there's only so much we can do with the resources that we have, but there are always things that we can do intentionally to better our situation. And that is part about asking yourself much better questions. The one good thing about tactical questions are that generally those are the pressure points that get us engaged in seeking out the quote-unquote answers. That's a positive with these tactical questions, is that they can be a pressure point. Doesn't mean we have to stay there. Because generally, in my experience, the answer to tactical questions, what should my allocation look like? What should my withdrawal rate look like? All those type of things are actually pretty easy to determine if you've done the legwork first on what you're trying to accomplish. I'm going to use an analogy. I don't know if it's a great one or not, but let's go for it. So imagine you want to build a birdhouse. Okay, well, that's the first big strategic decision. You're building a birdhouse, not a dollhouse. Then you want to define, okay, at the end of this, what do I want that birdhouse to look like? Is it 2-story? Is it brown? Is it red? Does it have multiple poles for the little birdies to sit on, or just one? Is it a nesting house or a condominium? Those bigger questions need to be defined on the front end. And then you work your way down to the tactical. So by the time that you're getting to, do I use a screwdriver or a hammer because I'm using a nail or a screw? Those questions become a lot easier once you have the big picture down and you've worked your way down to the actual assembly of the thing. It's very similar to your life, with the one exception that your life is never a final product. It's always in the design phase because who you are and what you care about will change multiple times, so you have to have a process to catch all that. When we talk about having better questions, it's about, hey, let's focus on really what we're trying to do here. And as a consequence of that, when we get to the tactical things, it's almost a foregone conclusion, at least that I find, is as we go through the process, it just naturally flows to where we can make better decisions. So that's why in the ARM process that I use, we start off, okay, what is the ideal retirement that we want to have? Let's paint that and make it as big as possible so we don't leave anything on the table. And let's have that be our ultimate goal. And then once we've defined that in reasonable terms, not definite terms, then we work our way down to, okay, where do we see ourselves 3 years from now? And then where do we see ourselves 1 year from now? If we do those three things, big picture, 3-year outlook, 1-year outlook for what we want our life to look like, when we get to the cash flow conversation or the net worth conversation, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what tactics will work to marshal our assets to work towards what we've defined. That is the only way I know how to answer all those tactical questions, is to know where the heck we want to go. And that is where I think you need to focus. And that's one reason why we have ARM work that way. Now, it's very difficult to define some things, right? I mean, especially for younger folk when it comes to retirement. That's why I say don't think about retirement if you're younger. Think about asset accumulation, but just keep looking on the horizon. But a lot of times it can be hard to find answers to things like, what do I want the rest of my life to look like? So one powerful question I think you can ask when you find yourself stuck on a decision is ask yourself, well, if I knew the answer, just hypothetically, what would it be? This can be a really powerful question to help free you to say possibly something you're not willing to admit consciously. And when I say, what do you want to do in terms of course of action, and I make it definitive, you answering that question, it feels like when you say it, when you verbalize it, you are obligated to it. I was having a conversation like this with a good friend when I was in Wyoming recently, where he was grappling with an issue and he could see going both directions. And I used this question with him, and he actually answered it pretty quickly. And then I helped him see, well, maybe that is the answer. But for me, just say, well, which one do you want to do? For him, it felt like if he told me, then it was a definitive choice. But just by saying, okay, if I knew the answer, only hypothetically, what would be the right thing to do? The fact that you phrase it in that it's hypothetical, you're not obligated to anything. I've been amazed over the years how that has helped people articulate what ultimately was their true feeling. They just felt afraid to say it almost subconsciously in a definitive way. So when you get stuck, ask yourself, if I knew the answer, hypothetically, what would it be? The second question that you can consider when you're trying to define where it is you want to go, so you know what your birdhouse is going to look like, is to get out of the moment. Because we live in tactics. I have no doubt that if you're like almost everybody, you're in the important but not necessarily urgent quadrant of life, right? You're just keeping everything moving. You're in tactic mode, and everything that talks to you from an advertising standpoint is in tactic mode. So when you're trying to think about these bigger issues of what this birdhouse of your life is going to look like, you got to get out of that. Because it's easy to let your fears or your desires of the moment greatly influence the direction of your entire life. And that's scary. So one way to get out of that tactical stuff and really take a bigger perspective of your life is to say, what would my 90-year-old self want me to do with whatever it is you're grappling with? Some people call it the rocking chair test. And I've used this in my life, okay? And that's one reason why I've started this podcast and the blog and everything else is because five years ago, whenever it was, I started to grapple with, okay, I got a decent life here. I could live a decent life, have lots of free time, but when I'm 65, would I be happy with what I created and wonder what could I have done? That was a lot of what drove me to start this podcast and to try to help change, not just help change, to change how people think about retirement, is asking myself this sort of 90-year-old self question. What would my 90-year-old self want me to do? And in my answer to myself was, I would want to know what was possible if I really put forth the effort. But pull yourself out of the immediate, because that is where we live, and use this test of, okay, when I'm 90 years old, am I going to regret not doing that? Or regret how hard I worked? Or regret that I didn't take a little extra time and spend a little bit of money on experiences? That's an important question. Another question that's critical, I think, a very quality question is, especially with retirement, is do I still want to do this? That's one reason in ARM, one of the principles is you're constantly reassessing all of the assumptions of the plan. And that doesn't necessarily mean financial. It means what we say we care about. In my experience, over 27 years, people change all the time, and what they care about changes constantly. So as much as we think we have to manage the investment assets and the financial stuff in life, it's important that you ask yourself, if you have a plan and you're working a particular direction, is this still what I want? Is this still the kind of life that I want to live? Do I still care about where I pointed the ship of my life? Because what I've found is many times people are making adjustments and reassessments on the life part of things, which affects the tactics used on the financial part of things. So it's an important question to ask. Now, one that I shared the other day, this next question is just as powerful, and that is, what does this make possible? I talked about two of my friends that had some really bad things happen, or unfortunate things, that could have really set them into a spiral emotionally, but they didn't, because they kept focusing on, they kept hammering on, what does this make possible? Okay, my house had a huge fire. I lost a ton of stuff. It's easy to wallow in that, but what does this make possible? What next new adventure does this free me to be able to do? Had someone that I work with recently unexpectedly have their position eliminated, and they were a A+ performer in their company. Took a day or two of yelling and screaming and anger, but eventually, when I saw him the other day, he was focused on, okay, what does this make possible? You have to get back into leaning forward mode when life hits you right upside the head. And then the next question is, whether it's an investment, a career decision, a purchase, anything like that, you always have to understand, how does this investment, action, decision, purchase help me move towards the life that I envision? Everything has to do that. I'm amazed how many times I see we define what the life is, or they tell me they know what their life vision is, but then we look at what they're doing in their career or in their cash flow, or we look at their assets and how they're being managed, and we realize, hey, this is not in congruence with what you say. You only have so much financial resources. Doesn't matter how many zeros are past the first number. You only have so many financial resources. It doesn't make any sense. It's not efficient if they're not all working towards the same goal. And if we stay in tactics, especially with investments, if we stay in tactic mode, what ends up happening is when you try to get everything organized and you build the net worth statement and you look at your assets and you realize, man, I got stuff all over the place that I've collected over the last 10 whatever years. And they're not all working the same direction. So a good question to ask is, how does each item on your balance sheet help move you towards your overall goal? And then the last question I want to talk about is, what can I do next? This is really where the rubber meets the road. It comes to, okay, if we have this long-term vision and we have a 3-year outlook of where we'd like to move the dial and a 1-year outlook where we'd like to move the dial, we always got to get down to, what do I do next? Because even if it's a 1-year outlook, there are probably 10 or 15 things that you could do over the next year to move the dial that direction. And that's one reason why you need to have prioritization. We can't do everything all the time. I don't even remember the story now. It's like if you try to grab all the birds, you get none, something like that. I don't know. But you get my point is, okay, in the next 12 months, there are probably a ton of things you could do to move the dial, but you have to prioritize. You can't do them all. And if you try to do them all, you're dividing your efforts and your focus, and you'll probably likely have less impact. That's one reason I like the idea of growth cycles in sprints, smart sprints, so we can prioritize what's the most important thing, hammer that sucker home, and then set another one. What can you do next is a great focusing question. So all of these questions can really help you get away from trying to get great answers and move towards having great questions and get you out of the tactical world that we're all swimming in. Rise above that. Create an image of the birdhouse that you want, realizing it's going to change, and start to take intentional action, whether it's in managing your investments or managing your life, to start building the life that you want, that your 90-year-old self is going to be really proud of.
On your marks, get set.
Hey, welcome to the Smart Sprint segment, where we set a 7-day goal to take one little baby step to creating a great life. So in the next 7 days, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down the focusing questions that we talked about today. If I knew the answer hypothetically, what would it be? What would my 90-year-old self want me to do? Do I still want this? What does this make possible? How does this help me towards my goal? What can I do next? I want you to write those down. Keep them on a 3x5 card. Keep them top of mind. And throughout your day, over the next 7 days, refer to them. And when you find yourself in a little quandary, use these as your guideposts, hopefully to be making better decisions. Hey, welcome to the Happy Lab, where we noodle on how to create a happier life. Now, I don't even know if I shared this one before, but I was in Wyoming recently with a bunch of just amazing men, and probably 10 of us, and we had a few dinners where we went out. And at dinner, it's common when you have, a number of people, is that you have all these side conversations going on where people are just talking amongst themselves. And I learned this a long time ago from a friend of mine, Ray Edwards. So I want to suggest that you try this at your next dinner party or when you're at a big table with people, is try to get everybody focused on one conversation rather than all these side conversations. So when Ray did it, I was at a table with he and maybe 12 of us. And the conversation was, what was the last book that you read and what impact did it have? So what we did was Ray started, and then we just went around the table, person by person, where they got to share the book, what they thought of it, and then there was a little bit of discussion around that book, and then we went to the next one. And what it does is create a lot more community and a lot more depth to the conversation. And I've tried it numerous times since then, and it works wonderfully, and it really creates a special dinner. So next time you're in a big meeting or a big dinner, get everybody focused on one question so you can all learn about each other. If you really want to have a great retirement and you're worried about all the different things we got to figure out, go to 5minuteretirementmakeover.com. It is a free 3-video series where I outline agile retirement management, something that will give you more clarity and more confidence in making financial decisions to create a great retirement. So check it out at 5minuteretirementmakeover.com.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.